The recent agreement to keep the Citgo sign over Kenmore Square follows months of anxiety over the struggle between preservation and market forces. Sometimes the two go hand in hand, but that synergy could be more elusive if there's any loss of help from the public sector. Our guest has been trying to reinforce that help in a recent trip to Washington, D.C. We'd like to welcome the Executive Director of the Boston Preservation Alliance, Greg Gaylor. Thank you very much for being with us, Greg.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I want to come back to the Citgo sign, and because you've also been preoccupied with the Northern Avenue Bridge. These are both things that were, pretty ordinary parts of the city at one time, pretty prosaic, and now we think they're special. Why is that?
Well, I think part of it is there are things that we grow to love and just expect to be part of the city that we forget aren't automatically there in the future. And as the years wear on, the city changes, and that's fine. The city is evolving, and that's all very exciting and a great part of being in a dynamic city. But the trick is, how do we keep the things that are character defining, that make Boston unique? And I think the Northern Avenue Bridge and the Citgo sign are two examples that I remember growing up with. The Northern Avenue Bridge, my organization has been trying to save since the 1970s. So it can be a bit frustrating, but I think people need to recognize that these things do take lots of time and lots of effort, and we shouldn't make assumptions about what will be here tomorrow. It's an active process.
What about the way these historic particulars change for us, because they're in a different setting. The Four-Point Channel, the waterfront has changed dramatically. Kenmore Square, this is not the days of the Rathskeller or even before that. What is it about this?
Well, again, I think there are these iconic things that help define the city. Often we think of the Old North Church or the Swan Boats or the State House Dome. These are all character defining aspects of the city that are recognized throughout the region, throughout the country. And that's one of the things that we think is particularly unique about the Citgo sign is, here in Boston, we think of it as a local landmark with a little L. We're trying to make it a formal landmark, but people from around the country and around the region recognize the Citgo sign. You mentioned I was in Washington. It was a remarkable meeting with our congressional delegation and walking into the offices and seeing pictures of Fenway Park and the Citgo sign. And I remember mentioning it to one of the staffers, and 4 heads popped up and people said, "What? We're going to get rid of the Citgo sign? That's crazy." People identify with interesting things. Sometimes it's hard to predict what they are, but when someone says they're going to go away, you suddenly recognize what they are.
And of course, people don't want to lose Fenway Park either. But talk about that distinction between the kind of unofficial landmark and official. Why is that so important?
Well, I mean, there is a legal mechanism to protect things here in the city of Boston. It's called making them a Boston landmark. There's a legal process that goes through the Boston Landmarks Commission, and the Citgo sign is in the midst of that process right now. So, one thing I think it's important for people to recognize, there was exciting news last week that a deal was reached between the new owner of the buildings that the Citgo sign sits on and the Citgo Corporation to preserve the sign. Citgo just leases the roof for the sign. I mean, that's literally what kind of arrangement it is. We haven't seen the details of that yet, but we're excited a deal has been reached. But that doesn't provide long-term permanent protection. The Citgo sign was fought about in the 1980s, so 30 years ago. So we don't want people 30 years ago to have the same debate. So if it's made a formal landmark, then that sign is protected. That doesn't mean it doesn't change, and I think that's a misconception people have, that all landmarks need to be able to evolve and change. The city changes, as you noted. So how do we manage that? Preservation is really about managing change and being thoughtful about change. It's not trying to freeze the city in time and saying you can't have new buildings, you can't have new construction, that the Citgo sign can't evolve. It now has LEDs, originally had neon, but it still is, in essence, our Citgo sign. So the landmark protection will have to encompass that and include language that allows for some evolution change, like all landmarks do.
Well, I know you don't want to box the developers in too much, but on the other hand, you don't want to replace what's under the sign with, let's say, another Millennium Tower, because it's not going to look the same.
Well, obviously, the height of the sign, that's something we've talked about. The Citgo sign is interesting because you can see it from so many places. Even someone who grew up in the city like me, and I hear this from many others, I'm always surprised, every few weeks you take a turn, it's like, oh my gosh, you can see the Citgo sign from here too. So, the Citgo sign it's about its design, it's about what it looks like, it's this spectacular signage, it's big, it's 60 by 60 feet, you can see it from so many different perspectives, and I think the relationship between the pedestrian and the sign, to me, one of the greatest views is when you come out of the train station at Kenmore Square, and you see the sign, it's big, it's dominant, but it's not oppressive, and you're right, if the building under it goes up another 20 stories, you move the sign up 20 stories, it's not the same Citgo sign.
Of course, another part of historic preservation is that if you get the status, you can cash in anyway. There are tax credits depending on what kind of status you get. And you were in Washington, I imagine you were talking to people about this too.
It was. I mean, it's easy to sort of conflate different things. So landmarking doesn't really provide a tax credit. Now, if the property owner wanted to give an easement, that would be a different way of protecting it. There is some opportunity for some tax credits there. I was in Washington talking about something a little bit different, several issues, but we were meeting with the delegation about the historic tax credit, which is a federal program most people don't know much about. But since 2002, it's helped over 400 projects here in Massachusetts with a development cost of almost $4 billion. Across the nation, it's been a huge process, over 2.3 million jobs through this program. And what this does is it allows people who own property that's on the National Register of Historic Places, income-producing property, so these are for commercial ventures, if they rehabilitate that property in a way that meets guidelines that are reviewed by, in Massachusetts, the Mass Historical Commission and then the National Park Service, they're eligible for up to a 20% credit on the rehabilitation cost. This is a hugely important program, and in fact, it generates more revenue for the federal treasury than it costs. So about $5 billion revenue positive over the life of the program. So we're concerned with this discussion of tax reform that we're going to lose the historic tax credit. It's also frequently used with a low-income tax credit. So if you think of a historic building, an old school, that could be renovated, meeting these historic standards, and turned into affordable housing, you can get a double hit. And the reason that the tax credit's important and why it's important for us as taxpayers to invest in this is it triggers huge amounts of private investment. It also leverages and changes neighborhoods. So, buildings in neighborhoods that are lying fallow, not on the tax rolls, you do a couple with the tax credits, and then other developers come in to improve those projects in those neighborhoods.
And we have had buildings in Boston. I think of one building in Chinatown not so long ago that was redeveloped. It needed a lot of work, and there was a historic tax credit involved in that, and there was some affordable housing too.
There are a host of them all throughout the city, and sometimes it's big recognized projects that people know about. Sometimes it's smaller buildings in Roxbury, older apartment buildings. They just have to be 50 years or older and be listed on the National Register, and as long as the work proposed meets the standard, then they're eligible. So there's some projects over in the Navy Yard that have been challenged, some difficult projects that are going to be tax credit projects.
Finally, coming back to the Citgo sign, we think of preservation as a subsidy, whether it's by the government, the taxpayers, or even a developer. But what do we gain from that? What's the plus side of the equation?
Well, again, I don't necessarily think of it as a subsidy because I think generally it generates more revenue than it causes. And in fact, to landmark a property, it doesn't cost anyone anything except for the sort of internal staff process of doing it. The benefit is it's important for a city to recognize that it has a past, that its future is connected to its past. So there are a whole host of ways of looking at it. And part of the reason Boston is so successful economically and why people come here is we're unique. There's quirky parts of the city. One could argue the Citgo sign is a little bit funky and quirky. There are the deeply historic parts, the Freedom Trail, for example. Those are why people come to the city, and that's why businesses are moving to Downtown Crossing and Fort Point Channel, because those interesting historic characters are really energizing to people. They really foster the innovation economy in many ways.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Greg Gether from the Boston Preservation Alliance.